Okay, our next panel of experts is in the esports arena, but just like we always do here at the Racetrack Business Conference, the term esports might even mean different things to different people. It might mean electronic sports, electric sports, or extreme sports, and they all work because they all stand for esports. And it does seem a bit ironic, though, that a man who spent a great deal of his career working with the old school racers and old school racing organizations, like the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, like USAC, that he would be on the cutting edge of the esports marketing revolution, but he is. From Charge Sports, let's welcome Ken Unger.
On? Thanks, Dennis. Did you just call me old?
No, I said old school, old school.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to thank particularly Tim Frost and his team. Dennis, thank you for prepping all the panels. This is clearly one of the best shows in our industry. It's certainly the convention of motorsports. So thank you all for being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here as well.
I'll get you trained by the end of the day. Okay, when we told our next guest that being a speaker at RTBC was not rocket science, he got very disappointed because if it was rocket science, he'd be an expert at this. But no, all kidding aside, we've had a great relationship between PRI and SEMA, and one of the reasons for that, and one of the reasons that RTBC has had such a great relationship with the folks at SEMA is our next guest, John Warniak.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. D, as I affectionately call him, Dr. Demento, because that voice is great. So if you remember Dr. Demento, you are old school and old. But thank you. And I think SEMA and PRI, we're going in the right direction, and really it is for you. As Ken and I were just talking, the Racetrack Business Conference is number 6. By number 16, it's going to change a lot, Tim. Definitely. But my background as a systems engineer is basically the intersection of what I'll call technology and disruption. And there's a lot happening in terms of esports, the auto industry, and racing. And I've been very fortunate to have been part of all 3 of those industries, auto, aero, as well as racing, for about 25 years. And there's a lot of change coming when you think about what's happening with the industries and what we'll be talking about. And I'd like to start off with a story. When I talk about what's happening with what I'll call Industry 4.0, basically what's happening is the evolution of the industry. There's 2 slides I always like to start off with. And they're both pictures of a Manhattan street, New York, downtown Manhattan. One is from 1900. The other slide is a photo from 1910. On the slide from 1900, there are about 20, 25 vehicles on the road, on the street. Same thing with the 1910 photo. But in the 1900, there's 1 car and about 19 horses. In 1910, what do you think? There's 1 horse and 19 cars in a span of 10 years. And with respect to esports, what we'll be talking about today, consumption happens a heck of a lot faster today. So it only took 10 years for the car to become a mainstay. Think what's going to happen with esports in your business, particularly track ownership and racing organizations.
All right, Ken, I'm going to call myself old now because I tried to watch this drone racing on ESPN. Sorry, Bob Pockers. I didn't get it, but one thing that I did get is that these guys and ladies know how to brand themselves pretty darn good to be at that level. How can our local or regional race car drivers, I'm not talking the NASCARs and Indy World guys because they do a heck of a job, but how about our local sports stars? How can they represent and promote themselves better by using the e-sport model?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dennis, and it's something that I've seen. So I've been in this industry for about 21 years, and I've seen the same thing. If I go back at the beginning of my career and looking at it today, it's that a lot of our young race car drivers are ill-prepared for what's ahead of them both at the amateur level, working their way up the ranks to whatever their aspiration is, whether it's driving stock cars, open-wheel cars, sports cars, and HRA dragsters, same thing. They don't define who they are and what they stand for, their brand. And I'll ask a driver what their brand is when I meet them, because often I'll meet them at a race, and usually in a hospitality area, and they're eager to shake hands, looking for sponsors. And they really won't have an answer. They really don't know how to describe themselves. And often when they do, they say, well, I'm just an all-American racer. Well, if you race in the United States, you're all American racers. And there really isn't a way for sponsors and fans to connect with that because you haven't defined who you are. So whether it's esports or drone racing or motorsports, it's really important for racers to understand that if they want to attract investment, right, if they don't need sponsorship and if they don't need money to progress up the ladder, this doesn't apply to them, but 9.9 times out of 10 it does. You have to really be able to describe who you are and what you stand for and do it in an attractive way and use all the tools like social media, a great website, Facebook, everything to really put out the word about what your brand is. So what you see in esports, for example, is a lot of these players grew up. They never, if you're 16, 17, 18, 19, you never knew a world without social media. So socially at school, they used it, and so what they're doing in a very comfortable way is transitioning that into a way that describes who they are. And for them, for an esports athlete, it starts with their handle, because often they have a stage name that they use both in-game play and on social media. So they start with a brand about who they are and what they stand for. I don't think they do it better than racers. I think the challenge is the same, but those who don't focus on it will sacrifice success, I think, in the long run.
And similar to how skaters do it, like skateboarders do it, when it comes to branding themselves by, having something unique that you remember. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, a differentiator. I mean, to me, my definition of a brand is basically it's a combination of two things. One, it's your reputation and your image. Reputation is what you say, or basically your image is what you say about yourself, and that can be just open. You can make up anything you want to say about yourself. Your reputation is what others say about you. And when those two come into sync, that's when you have a very powerful brand. If you look at what Dale Jr. did with the E-Nation, I call it brand democracy. Basically, he turned his brand over to the fans, and look what he got in return. Tremendous following. I think 15 years he's been most popular driver, I think at least in the NASCAR world. And then there's kids like, who's ever heard of Rudy Van Buren? Nobody. He's the latest McLaren driver, the gamer that actually gets a chance to drive a physical car because he was so good at helping develop cars through virtual gaming and esports at McLaren. So a lot of gamers are actually going to build their brands either in the, if you will, the virtual world with Oculus and Forza and others, iRacing, and then transcend into the physical. So the coolest thing for all of us here, those things, those two forces are happening at the same time. So from a racetrack business perspective, great example here with David Vodden. How many folks have been to the self-racing days out at David's track? First Saturday of just about every 2 or 3 months? 40 autonomous racing cars out on the track. These are companies that you may have heard of, Apple, Google, NVIDIA. This chip I have is an NVIDIA chip. This is the standard chip in the robo-race cars. 1.8 trillion operations per second. It's not a computer chip. It's a graphics processing unit chip, or better yet, a system on a chip. And I think Ken can tell us more about the gaming industry. I think where a lot of that has transcended from into the physical racing.
Yeah, I think just for a little, to define what this is, because I think there are some people unfamiliar with it, that the esports industry derived from gaming. So basically video games. When broadband became very accessible and people could really start to network, they started to play games with other people virtually, often in other countries, but you could be playing a game with 5 people, 4 of whom live 1,000 miles from you. Well, over time, the video game culture became very competitive, and then probably about 10, 12 years ago, it really became popular to host events. So when you think about a motorsports event with a live race, they started to bring competitors live to a venue. and compete on video games, much like racers compete on the racetrack. So this industry has eventually grown into a $700 million a year industry. Most estimates have this moving over $1 billion a year within the next 18 months. And to give you some scale, about 300 million people watch esports games a year globally. So the global audience for Formula One is about 390 million. So from a scale perspective, this entire industry is picking up steam. It's now rivaling what is arguably one of the most successful forms of motorsport. And really, there's no limit to it. I hear a lot, especially when I talk to sponsors, that it's a flash in the pan because they just heard about it last year. This industry's been around for a decade. The growth curves are pretty strong from a financial perspective. And really what you see now is as much investment going into esports now as I saw in the motorsports industry in the late 90s, when you saw all the super speedways being built around the country, $100, $200, $300 million racetracks being built. We're seeing that scope of investment now in the esports industry.
Yeah, I might add too, Michael McClary from Forza Motorsports. By the way, I'm going to name drop a lot, but Roger Penske and Neil Young told me, don't name drop. But the point of that, Forza just crossed $1 billion with Forza 6. And one of the key aspects that he talked about was he had Henry Ford III, when they introduced the Ford GT, he said, I want to get the Ford GT into hands of people that can't afford to buy the physical car. So he released the product data to Forza long before the car came out. Now think of the risk. Most automakers don't give you any information about the car. Even SEMA might get 2 months in advance to actually do what we call measuring sessions. But to give that digital data out to, in this case, Forza, to the gaming world, so some 14-year-old kid like Wayne's World in his basement can race that Ford GT. Think what that does for opening up the market and getting them in as early as they possibly can, and more people to experience racing. So if you digitize, let's say, the Thunder Hill racetrack, the kid could be racing at Thunder Hill in his basement, not necessarily the Nürburgring or Le Mans.
Ken, what is needed as far as an infrastructure to host an event for one of these gamer groups? I mean, I could see a heck of a crossover of interest, and especially for marketing partner appeal, to do a big gaming event at a racetrack. But what kind of infrastructure is needed?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it varies, because typically when you look at the history of events in esports, they started in rooms exactly like this. I mean, exactly like this, on a stage exactly like this. And they evolved. They now, from an event perspective, the largest events fill the largest indoor arenas that we have. In the U.S., they've sold out events at Madison Square Garden. They sold out the Staples Center. I went to an event not long ago at Nationwide Arena where the Columbus Blue Jackets play. It's about a 13,000 person arena. There were 12,000 people there for an event. Now that kind of event is very expensive. And generally indoor events, there's high technical value. There's 200-foot screens, high def, network computers, everything that's needed behind the scenes to have an event like that. However, I've had at least 3 different promoter groups within motorsports ask that same question, and whether it's an outdoor event uncovered, or which is difficult, or whether you have a covered event at a racetrack, look at what happened last summer. Richmond hosted an event before its Cup race with the NASCAR Heat 3 game. They basically created a tournament within the race. It was a value add not only for fans to come watch this, but again, we're starting to see this convergence between the esports, motorsports games, like NASCAR Heat 3, Forza, Gran Turismo, others like that, and the opportunity to have live events at motorsport, in conjunction with motorsports events.
Yeah, the Formula E Series did something very cool at the Consumer Electronics Show this past January, where they teamed up around the world, had competitions, and they had a drive-off with 10 gamers versus the 10 industry drivers. Well, then they had the runoffs at Las Vegas in January at the show, and of the top 5 winners, first 3 were gamers. The best physical driver came in 4th. By the way, there was $1 million prize for that gamer. So the winner took home a purse of $200,000. So 15 years old from Belgium.
Ken, is this e-sport world just going to give us something else to compete for, not only for fans and for attention, but for those marketing partners?
Yeah, it really depends. And having gotten my start in sports and motorsports, obviously it's near and dear to my heart. So I care about what happens to this industry. And so I'm asked that question both in esports events and motorsports events. And my opinion is that it could either help or hurt motorsports depending on what motorsports does. Esports is not going to change the way they're doing things, except they're now getting much smarter in attracting sponsor investment, because they haven't been able to, in the past, to really truly articulate what is the value of a sponsor coming to an esports event, but they're getting better at it. So if you look at the target, which this sport, once upon a time, was awesome for males primarily, but males and females, but males primarily, ages 18 to 34. Motorsports rocked it out. I mean, this is where advertisers could find that demographic hanging out on a Saturday or Sunday. They're hanging out at esports events now. But motorsports can make changes to the way it does things. It could market itself differently, do different things at events, be more experiential, because certainly that age group is different than when I was 18 to 34, and this demographic wants experiences. So the more that a motorsports event at any level, short track, super speedway, the largest events, the smallest events, can be experiential, you'll attract that investment at the same rate that esports is. But if they don't, if motorsports doesn't, I have concerns about the industry long term, because there's only so much money from a marketing perspective, and it's going to go somewhere.
Absolutely. I think the point, will esports either hurt or help traditional motorsports, all of us here in this room? The answer is probably both. It depends on your worldview. And I don't mean by, the point is if you're not connected, you're probably not in business. It's your perspective of the world, not your age, but your perspective of that. And if you look at, did Apple change the e-music with iTunes? Yes. Is e-medicine helping every one of us with e-health? Probably yes. So the point is, it comes down to two factors. One is your culture, and the other one is basically your vision. And your culture is always going to win. You could have a strategy, and Ken talks about this as well. Culture will beat strategy every time, right? Always. Because the culture is the strongest thing that you possibly have. So the culture of your tracks, of your racing organization, that's where the real horsepower is, or chip power is today, to take that and move that forward. That is your essence. We heard earlier on some of the sessions, do what you do and do it the best. That's really where your core competency needs to be. And when you look at esports, it's going to change the world. It already is. It's not coming. It's here. It's already here. Take advantage of that. Be that bridge and connect to that. And keep one foot in the future and one grounded in today.
Before I throw it open to the audience for questions, anybody got questions? We got questions? Okay. I see one in the back there. We'll go back there next. But I got to ask you, Ken, what lessons can track owners and promoters, we talked about the athletes versus the drivers, what lessons can track owners and promoters learn from how esports is sort of promoting itself?
Yeah, I think there are great things that motorsports does that esports can learn from, and great things that esports does that motorsports can learn from. So your question is from, like, what can we in the motorsports industry learn from esports? I think one thing is they are experiential, meaning that when people participate in an esports event, they're experiencing it. They usually play the game that they're going to see. They know what's happening on the screen. They know what's happening with the players. They're given in their version of the midway area, kind of outside the auditorium. They're given an opportunity to kind of touch and feel the games and play the games. And the more that we can do that in the motorsports industry, I think the better. All the data, all the marketing data shows that fans want experiences. And so if you're a racetrack promoter, I mean, just one thing off the top of my head is every event should have these esports sleds. Everybody makes them. Forza makes them. Gran Turismo makes them. They're basically consumer simulators. And if you look at the lines, I mean, the Honda Indy Toronto race comes to mind. They had 6 networked sleds. There was never less than 40 people in line to sit in them and compete against each other. And that adds to the overall event. People go home and, yeah, it was a great race, but they had a great time at the event. It was a big event. Why? Well, they played a video game. I mean, it's nothing more than that. But esports has the experiential thing down. It's 24/7, 365. So the more you can extend that experience through social media, from your tracks and from every place else, you can experience esports every day, all year round. So how do you extend that experience? Well, it's for tracks, it's through social media. So those are, Dennis, those are a couple of the lessons, I think.
Yeah, one comment on the experience there. You've got your physical experience at the track, but then again, when you think about the virtual experience with esports, it's still the same thing. Perception is reality. And when you take that experience, it's immersive. And the strongest brands, whether it's an athlete as a brand or a company or your track as a brand, is forming an emotional connection to the fan. And I say fans because the fan will impact 10 consumers or 10 customers. Go to the fans first because they're the go-to people that the others will say, hey, what do you think about this? So if you experience that or you build that emotional connection dimension into that experience with your products, that's the connection you want to form that brand for your track, for your organization.
I'm Phil from Racing Simulator Experience. Actually, guys, I would like to know, I've been involved in gaming and race car and racetrack for many decades, and we've seen this industry grows by 52%, 392 million in 1 year. At the speed they're going, even like the top sponsor in motorsports are now sponsor those gaming events, like Geico Gaming. Geico is like investing more money. Many companies that does the fan zone in motorsport are experimental companies. And I don't see more brands knocking on their doors. I provide my service to those activation companies which are doing experimental marketing. They're all in esports, and they're also in traditional like NASCAR, IndyCar. I see the same people in the fan zone, but there's no virtual reality, there's no sim racing. It's, I mean, what do you think it's going to take to bridge those people to sit down? That's my main question.
Okay. I think that's a great question because I've been on both sides of that, right? So at the racetrack side and the racing series side and now the sponsor side. And it's a chicken and egg issue because a lot of the companies that would fund that to bring it to the track are reticent to do it because right now the demographic doesn't fit what they want to market to. So to break that, someone's going to have to invest. The racetrack's going to have to invest. The racing series is going to have to invest. Or you'll have to really do a great job of marketing and get those right sponsors to invest in that. But you're absolutely right. The technology exists. Companies like yours have it ready to go. But who's going to invest in it? That's the issue right now for us because our demographic as an industry from the fan perspective is a little too old for that. Right? They're not the racing simulator necessarily market. So we've got to do things to drive that down, and investing in that long term is going to pay dividends. That's what I think.
One comment on there is basically in terms of open systems or open source, esports is open. In the virtual world, you can do things. You can take a turn and you can do 25 Gs and you won't die. So the point is you can do things you can't necessarily do in the physical world, but there's an old phrase called high tech, high touch. And basically, people want to engage, but it has to simulate some physical environment that they know is reality to make it real. Otherwise, it's just Star Trek kind of stuff. So they really want to connect the physical and the virtual worlds together, and the best brands that position there have a digital strategy to be there. And that digital strategy can change, it can pivot, it can do all sorts of things just like that. You can't necessarily do that in the physical world because of capital investments, things like that. But in the virtual world, you can. You can take those chances. Those experiments can be done virtually.
I mentioned to Dennis, Ronnie Ball, something about drag strip. Well, what about drag strips? This is a piece of knowledge for the drag strips. I'm sure some of you are already doing it. But this week will be his second annual Digital Delay Practice Tree Showdown. Last year you had 160 cars for the first event. But that's a great wintertime gaming for the drag strips. Just wanted to share.
That's great. How many folks are involved with that? Anybody here?
Great wintertime running.
Wow. And are those gas-powered cars as well as electric?
No, it's delayed.
Just delayed?
It's electric. It's a
Okay.
tree.
Wow.
Practice tree.
Wow.
They just all get together.
So it doesn't matter what vehicle or what the powertrain is.
Practice tree set up and they're racking it out.
Wow.
And that's a great example. I mean, every form of motorsport has that type of opportunity to do that. So from a simulator perspective, Dodge brought its racing simulators to the U.S. national event Labor Day here in Indy. The line was 20, 30 person deep to sit in their simulators for a mock drag race. They brought that same simulator to SEMA. They had the same thing. They had lines around the display for people who wanted to do that. Again, people want to experience that. They're probably not going to have the opportunity to drive a dragster, but they will have an opportunity to drive a sim of it. And that's great for the sport because now if they were not a fan before, they learned how to sample it, and that could be a way to entice them to be a fan in the future.
Okay, Ken, I got taken to a gamers convention of a little different style, but same sort of clientele by my future son-in-law a few weekends ago. And I got to realize that some of the big stars in that type of gaming were a little tough to deal with as far as follow through on finishing off things for their marketing partners. But is that so much different than some of our old school racers?
No. I kind of laugh when I see that, especially having been in motorsports so long, dealing with drivers for my entire career. I'm an NFL agent, so I deal with football players all the time. Same thing. NBA, same thing. I think so you see that in esports, and that one of the issues is an old gamer is probably 17, 18, 19 years old. What were you doing when you were 17, 18? And did you understand the importance of sponsor commitments? It's really for that. I think the lesson for that, Dennis, is that so there are now esports teams that rival motorsports teams in terms of size, sophistication, staffing. They have to create a culture within their organization and ensure that their drivers, in this case players, understand that. The lifeblood of motorsports is money, and money generally comes from sponsors. So I found that drivers are probably best at understanding those types of commitments, participating in fan autograph sessions, going to sponsor meet and greets. The same thing has to happen in all sports, but especially esports, because there's a lot of similarity in terms of reliance on sponsor dollars and things like that. I think the culture starts at the team and gets transmitted to the athlete.
Excellent. John, your final thing for the day. Wrap us up, young man.
I think the biggest takeaway, as I mentioned my opening remarks there about disruption and technology. And technology is here. I heard you ask the question to Jay over there, but is technology good or bad for motorsports? The answer is yes. And the point is, it's going to keep on happening. I think the most important thing, disruptive technologies don't necessarily eliminate existing technologies. We still have print, yet we still have digital media, so they exist. But the point is, what disruptive technologies do, like esports, is eliminate companies, not the technologies. Don't be one of those companies, or better yet, don't be one of those tracks.
What did we learn today? Well, we learned that change is inevitable except from a vending machine, and that esports are here to stay. The younger demographic is trending towards esports, but if you give them a reason to be excited about your motorsports event, you can still lure them in and keep them coming back if you have an event and an experience that they will remember, and also involving esport gaming, simulator racing at your current events can let your race fans feel that love that they have for the sport even more, so it can work out very, very well. Ladies and gentlemen, for our esports panelists.